Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in the book of Galatians by Paul. We have examined chapter 1 and chapter 2, which dealt with the Paul's apostolic defense of his apostolic authority, and now chapters 3 and 4 deal with his apologetics concerning his gospel. It's his defense of faith against works, faith against the law, and the explanation of what does it mean to say that Christ has fulfilled the law. Because the Ebionites had a very different version of that terminology. They considered the fulfillment of the law by Christ to be the fact that Christ exemplified the more perfect way to obey the law, but he did not do away with the law. Whereas for Paul, the law has been fulfilled because grace has won the day, and the revelation in Christ has revealed that we are saved by faith and not of works, lest any man should boast. So we are looking at chapters 3 and 4 as that defense of the gospel of faith. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at chapter 3, 15 through 24. So let's begin by taking a look at the triad on the left. We'll take a look at verse 15. And Paul begins with by saying that he is speaking with apostolic authority, but of course he's speaking as just a man. But he says that he is also speaking of a ratified covenant. It is a kirao diatheke, the covenant that has been confirmed and validated with divine authority. So Paul says the gospel he proclaims is the gospel of a new covenant that has been validated and confirmed. And it is a covenant that because it has been divinely ratified and validated, no one has the right to tamper with it. No one has the right to alter its form or its content. Atheteo, you cannot set it aside as if it had no value, and epidiatasso, and no one can add to this new covenant of grace. Nothing can be tacked on to qualify it. So Paul begins by saying that his gospel of pisteuo faith is a covenant faith that cannot be altered or added to. And he wants to prove that by addressing the patriarch of Abraham. So let's go on to verse 16. To Abraham it was as promised that he was told that his seed would be multiplied. Under the new covenant, this still holds true through the spiritual lineage of Christ. Through faithfulness, the kingdom will increase. So the new covenant has its heritage in the old covenant that was made prior to the law with Abraham, because that was a covenant of promise. So Paul claims his gospel to have its historicity in the covenant of promise to Abraham, which was that covenant which preceded the Mosaic covenant. So he says that this spiritual lineage of Christ is a spiritual lineage which attaches to the promise to Abraham. And those are both based on epangelia reo, the overspill or the surplus of divine promise. Abraham received his covenant through the divine surplus of promise, and this mediation of the surplus of promise also applies to the new covenant in Christ, which fulfills the Abrahamic covenant. So for Paul, it is critical to understand that Christ is a fulfillment of the law because Christ is a fulfillment of the Abraham covenant of promise. He fulfills the primary Abraham covenant of promise, which preceded the Mosaic law. So Paul very specifically states his case of what does it mean for Christ to be the fulfillment of the law. Fulfillment means that Christ fulfills that which is in alignment with his grace, and that would be the original covenant of promise to Abraham. And so in verse 16, we take a look at note 3. The promise made to Abraham was to himself and to his offspring of one, that one being Christ, because offspring appears here in verse 16 in the singular. God's covenant promise was eschatologically aimed toward Christ all along. Abraham's descendants are not biologically defined. Abraham's descendants are essentially Christologically defined. The multiplied seed of Abraham will be the multiplied seed of those of faith in Christ. Abraham's covenant was always intended to be eschatologically aimed toward Jesus Christ, says Paul. So he takes a giant partitioning and partitions away the law and says that the spiritual lineage of New Covenant its historicity is the covenant of promise to Abraham. And now if you look at verses 17 and 18, the third block, furthermore, the covenant of promise cannot be annulled by the works of the law, because God the Father has ratified and confirmed this covenant through his Spirit and the Lordship of Christ. Therefore, says Paul, the law cannot make this covenant of faith and promise of no effect. The covenant of promise and faith is prioritized over the law, because Abraham was granted the covenant through promise. Again, he emphasizes Abraham was granted the covenant through promise. And Paul says in note 2, if covenant was of the law, then we could not understand covenant as promise. If it's out of the law that we receive this inheritance of salvation, then the gospel is no longer the covenant of promise. But then he adds, but we know that Abraham was granted the covenant through promise. And so our conclusive comments by Paul, if you look at 2d, the covenant of promise comes before the law. Promise establishes a religion of God's initiative of grace. Law establishes a religion of man's duty. For Paul, the law is an interim covenant. That's key to understanding what he's doing here. For Paul, the law was a period of interim covenant, subordinated to the Abraham covenant of promise. It was an interim covenant, and it was provisional, and it was to be subordinated to Abraham's covenant of promise. The Abrahamic covenant is a covenant of grace. The Mosaic covenant is a covenant of human obedience. Huge difference. Paul is making perfectly clear how he is interpreting fulfillment of the law. It's key to understanding his apologetics of his gospel here in 3 and 4, chapters 3 and 4. So let's move on to triad on the right, and take a look at verses 19 through 24 of chapter 3. And in 19 and 20 we learn that Paul says, why then was the law given? And he answers that it was placed alongside the covenant of promise because of current ongoing transgressions. It was provisional until it should come. In other words, it was provisional until the time of the coming of the spiritual seed of God. And he says that is the mediator, another who is of God himself. So until Christ could come, the law was given as a provisional measure. That's why. Why was the law given? It was given as a provisional measure to regulate and to keep in check the current ongoing transgressions until the time could fully come for the revelation of Christ. So Paul's issue is very much the issue of the relationship between promise and law. And initially he tells us in verses 19 and 20 that the law was a provisional covenant, a provisional temporary covenant. Now in verses 21 and 22, therefore, Paul asks, is the law contrary to the promised covenant? And he says, me genoito, never will it be contrary. The law will never be contrary to the gospel of grace. It will never be contrary to the promised covenant. But he goes on to say, but it was not empowered to impart righteousness. It was never the intent of the provisional law to impart righteousness. And he uses dunamis again. In other words, it was not to be a potential power of enacting righteousness. Instead, the law was given to reveal that all humanity, all individuals are closed up and imprisoned by sin. It was given to reveal our condition, our fallen nature of being imprisoned in sin. And it was also to reveal to us the necessity of the need for the promise of faith in Christ. And through that promise of faith in Christ, we wait for that arrival that would be put in place for all of humanity as the goal of the initial promise to Abraham. That righteousness and justification could come for all those who are always believing. And Paul uses the present participle here, so not just those who believe once, but those who live a life of believing. Those who live a life of active faith in Jesus Christ, they shall receive the inheritance of salvation. The elect, the anointed, the elect and the anointed, the elect and those who are baptized in the Spirit, those who practice an ongoing life of faith in Jesus Christ, shall receive the inheritance of salvation that the law could never bring. The law was simply provisional and regulatory to keep transgressions in check. So let's take a look at verses 23 and 24. And we see here that verse 23, before faith had come and been revealed, we were guarded and protected under the law. It did serve a positive purpose. It regulated the transgressions that were taking place. So it was a guarding and a protection, but it also shut us out from the promise of faith. It partitioned us away from the possibility and the assurance of faith, which was to be revealed later, says Paul. So we had a provisional covenant of law to help us keep in check, to reveal our situation, and to also make known to us the need for that revelatory content that would come later of faith in Christ. Now, verse 24, Paul concludes the law was our schoolmaster that led us to Christ and justification. So Paul says that the provisional covenant of law was a guide of authority, a guide of divine authority unto Christ. So it was in a way, it could be looked at as a sign, as a guide of authority. By disclosing who we are in our fallenness, and by disclosing what we need and desire through God's grace, it functioned as a schoolmaster to lead us to Christ and the Christ of faith, that we might be justified. And so I've taken, and if you look at 3:3, I've got 4 conclusive statements from Bower in his commentary. The giving of the law through angels became an assumption of Jewish tradition. The law was ordained by angels under the hand of Moses as mediator. Paul wants to stress the separation of God from the Mosaic law, from that provisional covenant of law. The law was given as a provision to restrain transgressions already taking place. It was provisional. It was a provisional keeping in check of transgressions, a provisional keeping in check of the fallen nature of humanity. for the time when it would become full, and there would be the full revelatory content of God's grace through Christ and the faith of Christ. So we get in these verses from chapter 3, 15 through 24, we get a tremendous defense by Paul of the fact that his gospel of grace has its historicity in the covenant of promise made to Abraham. He does not go back to Moses, he goes back to Abraham, and he says the covenant of promise preceded the provisional covenant of the law. The provisional covenant of the law was always to be provisional. It was always to be a check and a guide and a directive to keep humanity's transgressions in check. But it did not usurp the true covenant of promise, because that was made to Abraham. And so Paul says we look to Abraham as that which preceded the gospel of grace in Christ. The Mosaic law was provisional only. And thereby, by looking back to Abraham, we realize that the provisional nature of the covenant of the law was to lead us to the ultimate revelatory event of a new covenant of promise through the faithfulness of Jesus Christ, through the faith of Christ. So we get a tremendous defense, a tremendous apologetics here from Paul toward specifically the false teachers being the Judaizers or the Ebionites, because they had a very distorted view of fulfillment of the law. They truly misunderstood the meaning of fulfillment of the law. And so Paul points out that Christ fulfills the law by fulfilling the covenant of promise. That is what it means to fulfill the law. It means to transcend it, because Christ fulfills the covenant of promise to Abraham. So that's the way we understand fulfillment of Old Covenant, says Paul. To correct these Ebionites, to correct these Judaizers, and to teach the congregation of South Galatia, don't let these false teachers lead you astray. Don't take on a bondage to the law, because the law was always provisional. Always. Look back to Abraham, and then look again to Christ, and again to Christ, to the cross, and the resurrection and the ascension. That's going to wrap up this 8th lesson on the book of Galatians.